One day a certain Werner Wolty was brought into my office. He had been detained at a railroad station in Edinburgh, and judging from the report I had received, he was facing some pretty heavy charges. On the morning of the day of his arrest, Wolty came to the small station of Buckpool in the county of Banffshire. The porter who met him said that the train for Aberdeen had just left and advised him to walk to Buckie, where he could catch a train in the right direction. In his hands, Wolty held a large and heavy suitcase. Though it was quite a long way to the other station, he took the porter's advice. He arrived at the station in time to catch the Aberdeen train. At Aberdeen, Wolty caught the train to Edinburgh. By 5 o'clock in the evening, Wolty reached that city. Here, at the station, he asked the porter about the time of departure for London. The Edinburgh porter advised Wolty to leave his suitcase in the luggage room and walk around the city, as the train did not leave until 10 o'clock in the evening. Wolty heeded the advice this time too. Neither at the station in Buckpool nor in Edinburgh did anyone notice that Wolty's suitcase was soaking wet. Nor did anyone think it strange that he was there, even though Wolty spoke with a distinctly foreign accent. When questioned, Wolty said that after leaving his luggage in the luggage room, he went into town. There he went to a barber shop, and then to pass the time he went to a movie. At 9 o'clock in the evening he returned to the station. A Coast Guard detachment, making its rounds of the station, found a rubber inflatable boat floating near Backer. The boat was pulled ashore. Examination revealed that the boat was manufactured in Germany. The Coast Guard detachment immediately reported their find to the police. The police called the local railroad station, where it was learned that one of the porters had seen a suspicious man interested in a train to Aberdeen. From Aberdeen, the trail led to Edinburgh. Police Inspector McNeill was assigned the task of tracking down the unknown man. It was not an easy task. After all, at this busy station every day there are hundreds of passengers, and the station staff may not have paid attention to the stranger. But McNeill's persistence was rewarded. He managed to find a porter who said he had spoken to a foreigner and that he had recently left his luggage in the luggage room and had gone to the city. At the luggage room, McNeill produced his identification and demanded to see the luggage left behind by the stranger. McNeill immediately saw that the suitcase was soaked through. Breaking the lock, he opened the suitcase. His suspicions were confirmed. In the suitcase was a small but powerful radio with a set of batteries and lamps. The radio was in perfect working order. Water had not penetrated the case protecting it. In the suitcase was also found a notebook of addresses, a cipher pad, and 2 discs of some kind, each with a few letters on its surface. McNeill was overcome with unhappy reflection. He could hardly expect to find a stranger in Edinburgh, whose identity was practically unknown. Of course, the man must eventually return for his luggage, and so McNeill decided to wait. At precisely 9 o'clock in the evening, Wolty arrived at the station. He sought out a porter he knew and asked him to retrieve his suitcase from the luggage room. But the porter had already been alerted by McNeill and had discreetly signalled the nearby police officers. Wolty failed to offer any serious resistance at the time of his arrest, despite the fact that a loaded pistol was found in his jacket pocket. In addition, Wolty was seized a fairly large sum of English money, some Norwegian coins, a compass, topographical maps, and a Swiss passport. In his pants pocket was a piece of German-made sausage. Wolty produced an English national's registration card, which read Werner X. Wolty, 23 Sussex Gardens, London W2. In response to McNeill's official statement of arrest, Wolty said he was not German but Swiss. At the police station where Wolty was taken, he was charged with illegal entry into the country and remanded in custody pending investigation. The facts seemed to leave no doubt of Wolty's guilt. True, he did not admit that he landed on the Scottish coast from an inflatable boat, but numerous circumstantial clues indicated just that. Wolty was seen only 1.5 kilometres from the place where the boat was later found, and if Wolty could not explain how he got to Buckeye, it would not be difficult to confirm the version of his landing from the boat. Nor could Wolty deny the fact that he was the owner of the suitcase. The number of the receipt which Wolty had given to the porter at the station at 9 o'clock that evening corresponded exactly to the number of the sticker on the suitcase. 2 witnesses were present when Inspector McNeill opened the suitcase, and could confirm what items were in the suitcase. In addition, Walty could hardly satisfactorily explain why the loaded pistol seized at the time of his arrest was in his jacket pocket. Sure, the evidence completely incriminated Walty, but of what? With the incessant German air raids, it was urgent to get from Walty the information he might have. On the very day Walty was arrested, 2 other suspicious people were detained in Scotland, a man and a woman, who apparently were also German agents. So how did they manage to sneak into Scotland? Was their dispatch to these areas random, or were they the first swallows in the implementation of invasion plans for larger German contingents? It was also necessary to establish with whom these detained agents were to be in contact. These were the questions I had to ponder on the October morning in 1940, when Walty first came into my office. He was a thin, brown-haired man of medium height, in his 30s. I offered Walty a seat and a cigarette, but he irritably declined the offered cigarette. Walty did not appear to be a dangerous and experienced agent, but first impressions could be deceptive. An experienced spy knows how to hide his feelings, and it is these qualities that make him dangerous. Well, Mr. Walty, I began, addressing the prisoner in German, it seems that you are in trouble. The evidence is against you. You landed in Scotland from an inflatable boat. A walkie-talkie and a code book were found in your suitcase. A loaded pistol and topographical maps were seized from you. You will agree that these items expose you, and unless you can give some satisfactory explanation for everything, I shall have to charge you with espionage. That's not true. You are mistaken. Walty objected sharply. I am not a spy. I am an English subject. But when you were arrested, you claimed to be Swiss. That is correct. I was born in Switzerland. But I have an English registration card. I don't think it could have been issued to a German spy. I made no reply and began to study the detainee's papers in front of me. You are telling the truth. You do have an English registration card. It says you live in Sussex Garden Street. Do you like the neighbourhood? Yes, replied Walty, smiling. It's a lovely place. And you don't mind the noise of the trains? I don't understand, Walty muttered. Mr. Walty, Sussex Gardens is only 100 yards from a major train station. Perhaps you could tell me the station? Walty bit his lip. I beg your pardon, he said, but I haven't lived in this neighbourhood very long, and my English is not very good. I've never heard of the station you're interested in. For your information, it is called Paddington. Sussex Gardens is quite a long street. There are 2 very large streets running parallel to each other at either end, and to get to Sussex Gardens you have to go down one of them. Can you tell me the name of those streets? Walty shook his head negatively. Edgware Road and Westbourne Terrace. That's what those streets are called. You'll have to come up with more convincing evidence of your innocence. Now, let's see your registration card. Do you find anything odd about it? No, nothing, Walty answered. I do. The colour of the card and the paper it's made of are correct. But whoever wrote the number on the card was careless. Look at the number 1, isn't it too high? And the number 7? At the bottom the vertical line is crossed by a small dash. The number 1 is only written like that on the continent, and yet it looks very much like a 7. To avoid confusion, the number 7 is written with a dash at the bottom of the vertical line. The person who wrote the number on your card probably didn't know that in England they spell these numbers differently. Whatever you say, I maintain that this card was not filled out in England. Walty was silent. He sat opposite me with his head bowed low. I could see the vein on his temple beating frequently. Listen, Walty, I went on. You are an honest man, and you are not a liar. Why don't you want to tell the truth? What's in it for me to tell the truth? Walty asked after a long thought. Would it save my life? I can't answer that question. In England, the security authorities do not determine the degree of punishment. The case goes to the court, in whose hands the fate of the accused rests. Nevertheless, I must point out to you that a full confession will not harm you, and may even make your fate easier. What do you mean? All the evidence against you. A walkie-talkie made in Germany, German maps, an encryption notebook with notes in German. The court will undoubtedly find you guilty of espionage. I can't promise anything, but if you agree to help us and tell the truth, it will certainly be mentioned at the trial. It may, of course, influence the jury's decision. Walty thought for a moment. Then he asked, "What is the penalty for someone accused of espionage?" "Death." "And if I agree to help you? Would I be entitled to leniency in that case?" "Maybe. But I repeat, it is for the court to decide." There's another long pause. Walty seemed to be deciding whether to take his last chance. He blinked a lot, began to swallow his saliva as if he were short of breath. Finally he spoke. "All right, I'll tell you everything. You will realize that I am not an enemy of England, and that I was forced to take up a black deed." Walty began his story. According to him, he was a Swiss merchant. As a citizen of a neutral country, he continued to conduct commercial operations in Holland after the occupation of the country by the Germans. One of the Dutch firms with which he was associated belonged to two Jewish brothers. They feared for their lives and asked Walty to help them escape from Holland. As a foreigner, Walty enjoyed freedom of movement and had acquaintances in France. He agreed to help his Dutch business partners to escort them to the border. They were to cross into France at night. When Walty, after seeing his friends off, returned to the hotel in Antwerp and opened the door to his room, 3 Gestapo men were waiting for him. After beating Walty, they accused him of helping Jews. Walty then thought that his friends had failed to escape and that they had given him away to the Gestapo. The Germans took away all of Walty's belongings and threatened to send him to Germany for trial. He was told that for his offence he would either be executed or imprisoned for a long time in a concentration camp. However, according to the Gestapo men, Walty could save himself by volunteering to help them. Gestapovci said then that the German troops will soon invade England, and although it is unlikely that to defeat the British they will need more time than to capture France, still Germany would be good to have their agents in England in advance. Walty's task was not difficult. He had only to get with a suitcase to the coast of England, arrive in London, and at the station to meet with a German agent. The appearance of this man and the password to contact him would help Walty avoid making a mistake. After handing over the suitcase, Walty could safely stay in England, waiting for the landing of German troops in the British Isles and their entry into London. Walty was promised a handsome reward for completing the task. Walty may have been a coward, but there was hardly any reason to consider him a fool. If the assignment was really so simple, why did not the Gestapo secretly send one of their officers to England? Walty made an attempt to express his thoughts to the Gestapo, but all of them were sharply rejected. He was told quite definitely either he will give his consent or will be immediately sent to Germany as an enemy of the Third Reich. Having no choice, Walty agreed to go to England, but demanded to first familiarize him with the contents of the suitcase. Walty feared that the suitcase would contain explosives and he would have to hand over the shipment to a German saboteur in England. The Gestapo assured Walty that there would be nothing dangerous in the suitcase, and shortly before departure he was even shown all the things they intended to put in the suitcase. At this point I interrupted Walty. "Tell me, what purpose do the 2 discs found in the suitcase serve?" "Oh, it's a simple but rather ingenious device. There is a hole in the center of each disc. If a rod is inserted into these holes, the small disc will rotate around the large disc. The Germans told me that there is a predetermined cipher for each day, such as SR. This means that the discs should be set in such a position that the letter S on the upper disc is in line with the letter R on the lower disc. When you send a radiogram, each word from the upper disc is replaced by its corresponding word from the lower disc." "That's exactly what I assumed. Now go on," I said.
Walty began to talk again. He thought at first that he would be sent to England 1 to 2 days after his arrest, but several months passed and he still remained in Antwerp. He did not know the reason for the delay, nor was he much interested in it. Walty considered every day in Antwerp a day one, especially since, after he agreed to cooperate with the Gestapo, he did not live so badly.
One day Walty was sent on an airplane to Oslo without any warning. There he met two other volunteers, a man and a woman, who were to be his companions. They stayed in Oslo for about a week. Finally, Walty and his partners were ordered to prepare for departure. An hour later they were taken to the port and put on a large seaplane. Already in the air, the intelligence officer accompanying them explained that there were two inflatable boats on board, one for a man and a woman and one for Walty. If conditions are favourable, the plane should make a landing on the water at a distance of 1.5 to 2 kilometres from the Scottish coast. The first to depart should be a man and a woman, and then, a little further south, and Walty. The agents were to reach the shore, navigating by compass. Once they reached the shore, the boats were to be sunk. The flight went well. Walty managed to reach the shore at the designated spot quite quickly. Before he was able to get out of the boat, the surging waves of the surf pelted the suitcase with water several times. Knowing that it was a long way to the nearest station, Walty did not want to get his shoes wet, so he pulled the boat ashore to remove the lock valve, vent the boat, and then flood it near the shore. But the valve was jammed by the moisture, and Walty, who was overcome with fear, could not manage it. Walty was afraid to stay long on shore, so as soon as he thought the valve had yielded, he pushed the boat into the water, hoping that it would now sink. Taking his suitcase, Walty walked briskly toward the station. I interrupted Walty again.
Thank you. It's all clear to me. Everything that happened to you in England we know. Tell me, Mr. Walty, what were you supposed to do in case you managed to get on the train to London?
I think I told you I was to meet a German agent at the London station. How would you recognise him? By his grey pinstripe suit. But a lot of men wear suits like that nowadays. This man has a scar on his forehead.
I see. What's the password?
He was supposed to come up to me and say, "I'm from Glasgow." "All right, let's take a break. You need to rest. Maybe we'll see you again soon." "I'm ready to help you in any way I can," said Walty. Now you realise that I never had any desire to help the Germans. I was forced to play the role of courier, but I had no intention of meeting a German agent at the station. When I arrived in London, I would try to leave my suitcase somewhere at once. This is all very interesting. We will continue our conversation next time. I pressed a button and summoned the escort, with whom Walty left. Immediately I called my colleagues who had detained Walty and asked if he had told them about the man from Glasgow. As it turned out, Walty had already mentioned him during preliminary questioning. The surveillance set up at the train station in London had not yet yielded any results. I leaned back in my chair and lit a cigarette. There were still a few details in Walty's story that needed to be clarified. I felt uneasy. The thought that Walty had lied, that somewhere in his papers I could find the right answer to the mystery, never left me. I spent the next day scrutinising all the documents related to Walty's case and going through his personal belongings. At last I found what I was looking for, and immediately summoned Walty to my office. Now I began as soon as we were alone. You claim that you were forced to cooperate with the Germans under threat of execution, and that this took place in Antwerp. You admitted that you knew the contents of the suitcase, and that on your arrival in London you intended to leave it somewhere and escape without handing it over to its destination. Do you confirm that? Walty nodded in agreement. If that is so, Mr. Walty, why did you not throw the suitcase into the sea immediately after disembarking from the boat? Why didn't you take the suitcase to the police? Why did you carry the suitcase all the way to Edinburgh, deposit it and come back for it? All this suggests that you intended to take the suitcase to London and hand it over to the right person. It's also possible that you intended to use a walkie-talkie. That you know how to use a radio is evidenced by your testimony about the purpose of the discs. I was too scared, Walty replied. I was afraid that the Gestapo were following me. I swear I wanted to drop the suitcase as soon as I reached London. But if you'd brought the suitcase to the police yourself, you wouldn't have to fear the Gestapo anymore. I hadn't thought of that. One more question. If you're so friendly to the English, why did you need a loaded pistol? I'd forgotten all about it. The gun was handed to me before I got on the boat. I put it in my pocket and completely forgot about it. I didn't even know it was loaded. You forgot about the gun. But a loaded gun weighs about a pound. You had it in your pocket all day and you didn't even think about it. It's hard to believe. And yet it's the truth. Let's leave that question open for the moment. You said you live permanently in Switzerland, didn't you? Yes. You were arrested by the Gestapo in Antwerp. That's correct. The passport I'm holding in my hand right now is Swiss, and it belongs to you. That is correct. Then please tell me why it doesn't have a Belgian entry stamp on it. That was pretty much the end of Walty's case. He could not answer the question, although he refused to admit that he was an agent of German intelligence. We were never able to find out whether Walty was Swiss or German. But there were too many unclear places in his testimony for him to expect any leniency. Werner Walty was put on trial. The trial took almost a full day, but the jury did not deliberate long. Walty was found guilty of espionage and sentenced to death. From June 1940 until the landing of Allied troops in Normandy 4 years later, England was cut off from the continent. And yet, many thousands of people managed to break through German cordons and cross the Channel safely. Many refugees were fleeing Gestapo persecution for political or other reasons. Among those who reached England safely were British servicemen who managed to escape from German captivity. There were among the refugees and German spies, skillfully attached to the stream of people looking for salvation. A persistent search is always fruitful. In those years, people persistently searched for ways of escape from Hitler's persecution. By the summer of 1940, German troops occupied Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, France. In all these countries there were patriots whose only desire was to meet the enemy in battle as soon as possible.
Norwegians are sailors by nature. The coast of Norway is riddled with fjords where you can easily hide a boat, and it is not surprising that for the Norwegians the way to escape has always been through the sea. The Germans tried to organize control and surveillance of the coast, but their efforts were in vain. Since 1942, not a day has passed that a boat, or sometimes even a ship, has not secretly left the coast of Norway with people fleeing the horrors of the Nazi regime. All these vessels were heading for the coast of Scotland. After proper vetting, many of the Norwegian refugees joined the ranks of sailors in the merchant fleet of Free Norway.
In the south of Europe, refugees travelled in other ways. The proximity of the coast of England, even inexperienced in maritime business people, could count on a successful crossing of the English Channel. But even here there were difficulties. The coast in these areas was guarded by the Germans much more strictly. There were also overland escape routes from the territories under Hitler's control. These routes passed through Holland, Belgium, and led to France. They resembled small streams that merged into a river of water, the powerful streams of which rushed to the sea. When I speak of escape routes, I mean primarily those served by local patriots. Usually a group of refugees was led by an experienced guide, well acquainted with the passages in the mountains. Once in Spain, however, the refugees did not always find freedom. Many of them ended up in the Miranda del Ebro camp and died there. The luckiest of the refugees who made it to Spain sometimes managed to contact their country's consulate in Spain before the Spanish authorities caught up with them. In such cases, the refugees still had to wait many months for official permission from the Spanish authorities to leave for Portugal and then England.
Who catered to these escape routes? They were brave people who risked their lives to help Nazi victims regain their freedom and join the ranks of the fighters.
Each route was a long chain of individual links, the first of which was usually a refugee assembly point. This was usually located in a house belonging to a member of the resistance movement. There, the refugees waited for the formation of a group and for the completion of preparations along their entire route. Depending on the situation, the group consisted of 2 or 3 people, and sometimes more than 10. Refugees sent through these channels were carefully checked by the local organizations of the resistance movement. This was necessary because the Germans often tried to include their agents in these groups and to uncover the routes of the refugees. As soon as preparations were finalized, each refugee to be sent was given the necessary documents and money, and sometimes food for the journey. The guides, working each on his own section of the route, passed the group to each other until it reached its destination. This method of operation had several advantages. First, each guide led the group on a section he knew well. In any unforeseen case, it was easy for him to find the right solution. Secondly, a reliable conspiracy was ensured, as one guide never knew more than 2 other guides operating in neighbouring sections. Thus, in case of arrest of one of the guides, the threat of failure occurred only on some parts of the route, and never the whole organisation was endangered. Some other means of escape from enemy-occupied territories were also used. For example, 2 Dutch pilots volunteered to work at an airfield occupied by the enemy after the Germans occupied the country. They worked diligently until they gained confidence. One day they were assigned to fly new fighter planes, and they took the opportunity to fly to England. The pilots not only saved themselves, but also delivered to the Allies the latest German airplanes, the creation of which the Germans kept in strict secrecy. Needless to say, such methods of escape could not be used often. In times of war, you cannot underestimate the abilities and capabilities of the enemy. The Germans quickly realized that the various ways of transporting refugees offered them excellent opportunities for the introduction of their agents and their penetration into England. One of the methods used by German intelligence was as follows. In the press and on the radio, it was widely publicized that a member of the local resistance movement, such as a Dutchman, was wanted. This person, of course, was a Gestapo agent, but it was not easy for the resistance organizations to expose him. The Germans deliberately created conditions in which this person could show himself as a patriot, a fighter against Hitler's occupiers. After the announcement of the wanted man, the Germans allowed the resistance organizations to smuggle this patriot to England without hindrance. Very often such agents of the Gestapo and German intelligence arrived in England as part of a group of refugees, among whom were long-established members of the resistance movement. Most often, agents of German intelligence under the guise of refugees crossed not by land routes, but across the English Channel. That is why British counterintelligence checked the refugees who came to England through the English Channel much more thoroughly than refugees who used other routes. I had just returned from the War Ministry and began to study the documents received when one of my assistants entered my office in extreme excitement. "I'm very glad you're back. I received an urgent assignment," he told me. "What is it?" "We've just received a message. 2 Frenchmen have landed on a plane in West Sussex." "Well, what's so special about that? I mean, there's plenty of planes on the continent."
Not like this one. The report says these Frenchmen built the plane that brought them to England. "The Wright brothers themselves," I said with a smile. "Only they weren't French, and they're long dead. Give me those amateur aviators."
"They have not arrived yet, but they will surely be delivered by evening." And indeed, in the evening 2 detainees were brought into my office. One of them looked about 30 years old. Slim, dark-haired, with a thin moustache, he looked very much like the famous American movie actor Ronald Colman. When he identified himself, I realized at once that he was a representative of one of the noble families of France. He had the title of Viscount. The other was almost twice as old as his companion. It was not difficult to recognize him as a footman. And so he was. He was the Viscount's personal chauffeur and footman. His name was Marcel. Even in my office, he kept at a distance from his master and answered, with a bow whenever the Viscount addressed him.
I asked the detainees to tell me about themselves. The Vicomte, of course, took the role of narrator. Marcel listened in silence.
The Viscount's father had been wounded in the First World War and had died relatively young in 1936, when his son had just celebrated his majority. The Viscount's mother, whose relatives lived in South America, left France immediately after her husband's death. In 1938 in Argentina, she married a large land magnate. The Viscount had been living in France all this time. After the outbreak of war, the Viscount became an officer in one of the cavalry divisions. The French army could not withstand the onslaught of German tanks and quickly capitulated. The Viscount returned to his estate. When the German troops occupied the area where the Viscount's estates were located, they quickly realized that the attitude of the local population to them will largely depend on the Viscount, who enjoyed great authority. Therefore, the local commandant tried to disturb the Viscount as little as possible. No troops were stationed on his estate. Harvest from the fields belonging to the Viscount, the Germans did not touch. The commandant even apologized to the Viscount for the fact that because of the lack of fuel he could not give him coupons for gasoline for his personal car. "You understand," said the Viscount, "that I did not ask for these privileges myself. On the contrary, I was even worried that I could not share with my people the hardships and difficulties experienced under the occupiers. I spoke about it and the German commandant, but he turned out to be a cunning beast and always avoided answering. Fortunately, people understood my situation and I was able to help them secretly. But my remorse never ceased to torment me. I wanted to do something to help the people wash away the shame of defeat. But..."
The Viscount went on to say that he had long been fond of flying and had an amateur pilot's license. The Viscount realized that no matter how correct the Germans were in their dealings with him, he remained their prisoner. One day, while walking, the Viscount approached his garage and saw Marcel wiping down his car. It was at that moment that the Viscount had the idea of escape. "Perhaps an airplane can be made by myself, using an automobile motor for the purpose," thought the Viscount. The idea, of course, was nonsense, but the Viscount decided not to give up. He was aware that he could not do without an assistant, and he shared his thoughts with Marcel, undertaking to keep the whole affair secret. Under the pretext of the need to organize personal affairs, Viscount managed to get permission to travel to Paris, where he acquired books on the design of aircraft. Studying technical literature was difficult for the Viscount, and it took a long time before he was able to understand all the intricacies of the design business.
To realize his plan, the Viscount had to make complex calculations. To England, more than 200 kilometers. The flight would require about 70 liters of gasoline. When designing the plane had to take into account the weight of gasoline and the weight of people.
Trying to keep his plan a secret, the Viscount worked on the development of drawings of the plane at night. Fortunately, the Germans did not bother him, and in the castle could find the necessary building material. Marcel managed to get a tarpaulin, which he and the Viscount covered the airplane frame. The landing gear was made from automobile wheels. Long months of laborious work bore fruit. In time, the real airplane was assembled in the stables. To reduce the danger of disclosure of the secret, the Viscount dismissed almost all of his servants and left only those on whom he could rely.
The assembly work was coming to an end. Now the problem of fuel had to be solved. The main difficulty was this: it was impossible in any way to show the Germans their interest in obtaining gasoline. A few kilometers from the estate was a German military fuel depot, but it was carefully guarded, and it was dangerous to count on bribing the guards. The inventive Marcel found a solution to the problem. He advised the Viscount to make it a rule to organize once a month a reception for the commandant and officers of the commandant's office. The Germans would arrive in automobiles, and their drivers, while the officers were enjoying themselves in the company of the Viscount, could be invited into the servants' room and given a good drink. Marcel, meanwhile, could use a hose to draw a little gasoline from the tank of each car. At first, the Viscount did not like Marcel's suggestion. He did not want to give a reception for the enemies of the motherland. However, a week later, seeing no other solution to the problem, the Viscount agreed and sent a dinner invitation to the commandant and the officers of the commandant's office. The invitation was accepted.
After each reception, the Viscount's gasoline supply grew. After 4 months, there was already enough gasoline for the flight.
At last, it was time to carry out the plan. Shortly before dawn, the Viscount and Marcel rolled the airplane out of the stable and onto the alley in front of the castle. A preliminary test was out of the question. It was now or never, that was the question before the Viscount and his friend. The engine started, and the plane, after running along the alley a few hundred meters, soared into the air. The way lay to England. The plane flew very low over the ground at a speed of no more than 80 kilometers per hour. Fortunately, the Germans for some reason did not pay any attention to the plane, and the fugitives managed to cross the English Channel at Le Treport. Only off the coast of England. The plane was met by British fighters, but Marcel waved a white flag, thus preventing a possible attack. Escorted by fighter planes, The Viscount's plane headed for the military airfield in West Sussex and landed safely. At first I was literally amazed at the audacity of the feat. This impression remained with me even after inspecting the airplane. I was only surprised that such a machine was able to take to the air, let alone fly a distance of over 200 kilometers. The fact of the flight was confirmed by the report of our fighter pilots who met the Viscount's plane as it flew over the English Channel.
I questioned the Viscount again and again until I had learned his testimony almost by heart. I asked him about his knowledge of the engines. He replied that Marcel did all the work and that he only helped him.
Not being an expert, I asked my colleagues from the Air Force to familiarize themselves with the Viscount's plane. There was no end to the admiration of the pilots, but I still asked them a few elementary questions about the engine and its technical characteristics. The next day I called the Viscount again. "I am sorry to disturb you," I began, as the Viscount settled himself in the chair opposite me, "but I am interested in a few details. First, about the gasoline. Have you ever had to pump gasoline out of the tanks of German automobiles with a hose?" "No," replied the Viscount. "That was Marcel's duty. I entertained the officers and could not be away for long."
I see. Tell me, where were the cars parked during the receptions? On arrival at the estate, the cars were usually parked at the front entrance of the chateau. The officers would get out of their cars and Marcel, after greeting the guests, would escort them to the second floor, to me. The drivers then rolled their cars to the parking lot, which was located at the servants' entrance. Here the cars would stay until the reception was over, and I would alert Marcel by phone. So you never approached the cars yourself?
Never.
One more question. About the engine you used for your airplane. Who took the engine off the car? You or Marcel?
Marcel did. Were any modifications made to the engine after it was installed in the airplane? Modifications? The Viscount was clearly taken aback by this question. Of course not. It's an excellent engine. I checked how Marcel had secured it to the airplane and found the job done perfectly. Are you familiar with how engines work? Very little, replied the Viscount, embarrassed. I can only make minor repairs. In this case, I relied entirely on Marcel. I know the principles of aerodynamics, and Marcel is a good mechanic. It was only our common knowledge that allowed us to build an airplane and fly to England.
Thank you, Viscount. That's all I wanted to know. After the Viscount had gone, I was deep in thought, and then I ordered Marcel to be brought in.
Tell me, Marcel, I began. Why did you do what you did? I do not understand the question, he said. Why did you become a traitor? You are wrong, Mr. Officer. I am not a traitor. I hate the Boche.
Maybe you do hate the Germans, but you agreed to work for them to save yourself. You've managed to fool the Viscount. He thinks you're loyal to him and loyal to your country. But you can't fool us.
I don't understand, Marcel said in a trembling voice. The facts are against you. You expected that no one would bother to examine the engine, or perhaps you even hoped that it would be damaged on landing and all evidence would disappear. But I had the engine scrutinized with the help of experts. I was told that a normal automobile engine had too low a compression ratio and could not be used on an airplane without proper modification. It took solid technical knowledge and the proper tools to do it. Perhaps, Mr. Viscount. Marcel started to explain, but I interrupted him. No, Marcel, the Viscount is not a mechanic. He doesn't know much about this business. One more thing. It wasn't enough to increase the compression ratio of the engine. You had to have high-octane gasoline. Who could get that kind of gasoline? Certainly not the Viscount. He was always busy with German officers at receptions. It was you who obtained this gasoline, and you could only do it with the help of the Germans, who must have brought you the gasoline on purpose. One last thing. Look at the map of France. This is the route of your flight. It passes close to a German fighter base. At Le Tréport, you flew directly over another such base, but not a single German plane tried to stop you. How could this have happened? The Germans knew of your flight and deliberately let you pass unimpeded. Why were the Germans so indifferent to the escape of 2 French patriots? Marcel asked, smiling slyly.
One patriot, Marcel, the Viscount. You were their agent. Well, when you learned of the Viscount's intentions, you immediately informed your masters. They ordered you to assist the Viscount in everything, and knew that if you could get to England, they could use you for spy work. After all, it would hardly occur to anyone to suspect a man who would expose himself to such a risk in order to get to England. The Germans, of course, didn't think of us checking every refugee. Now, Marcel, let's not waste any time. Confess everything.
But Marcel was stubborn. He never admitted his guilt and spent a long time trying to prove his innocence to me. In England, he was never brought to trial, and until 1945 he was in an internment camp. After the end of the war, he was sent to France. But even there, his trial did not take place the day before the beginning of the investigation. Marcel died in an automobile accident.
As for the Viscount, he voluntarily joined the ranks of the troops of Free France and participated in the battles in North Africa. The fate of the airplane on which the Viscount managed to reach England is unknown to me, but it could quite deservedly become an exhibit in any aviation museum.
In the previous story, I touched in general terms on the various ways of escape from the territories on the European continent occupied by the Nazis. Many of those who attempted to escape failed to achieve their goal. The successful realization of any escape plan required great courage and determination. Luck also played a role. Gestapo tentacles entangled all Europe from Norway to France. The Gestapo men were trained to deal with refugees and so-called enemies of the Reich. They knew where to keep watch to prevent the escape of people who were hiding from them. In order to deprive refugees of the support and help of the local population, the Gestapo imposed the strictest regime in the occupied territories, severely punishing any violation of the accepted order. And yet the number of refugees was enormous. In the summer of 1940, the flow of refugees arriving in England took such proportions that around London had to create several special camps, where refugees were kept until the end of the verification of their identity. Later, when the number of refugees decreased and a clear procedure for their treatment was established, each refugee was checked by specially appointed counterintelligence investigators. This vetting was not an easy task. There was no particular difficulty in establishing the identity of a refugee unless he could be vouched for by a person well known to the counterintelligence. For this reason, a strict record of all refugees was kept from the outset, and it was usually possible to identify new arrivals and verify their testimony with the help of their compatriots already in England. The governments of European states that emigrated to England provided the English counterintelligence lists of collaborators, and this gave us considerable help in identifying German agents among the dozens and hundreds of refugees. In addition, the counterintelligence officers of the respective countries participated in the screening of refugees held in the camps. One of the most capable investigators with whom I, as an English counterintelligence officer, had the opportunity to work was a Belgian named Leopold. One day, on one of my first days as a counterintelligence officer in charge of refugee screening, Leopold came to me and reported that he suspected a German intelligence agent in one of the refugees.
From Leopold's story, I learned that he interrogated a Belgian man, a man of about 45 years old, who identified himself as Jules Verret. When questioned, Verret said that he was a native of Courtrai, a small town near the Franco-Belgian border. He is a waiter by profession. Most recently, he had worked in a hotel in Antwerp. In 1940, the Germans requisitioned the hotel, and having lost his job, Verret returned to his hometown, where he could not settle down for a long time. Some time later, Verret's nephew recruited him to join the resistance movement.
It was clear from Verret's testimony that he regarded the activities of the resistance movement organization as some kind of child's play. The organization had a small printing press at its disposal, which was used to produce anti-fascist leaflets urging Belgians to resist the occupying forces. The members of the organization were themselves engaged in the distribution of these leaflets. As Verret stated, the whole activity of the organization seemed to be a meaningless occupation, but it gave him and other members of the organization moral satisfaction. One day Verret had to meet his comrades at an agreed-upon place at 8 o'clock. At that time he was working as a waiter in a local cafe, and an unexpected influx of customers prevented him from getting to the meeting on time. It was not until 9:30 that Wert reached the street where the meeting place was located. From afar he noticed that a German car and a van were parked outside the house he wanted. The entrance to the building was guarded by 2 sentries with automatic rifles in their hands. Wert immediately suspected trouble and hastened to escape.
Already at home, Weret realized the danger that threatened him. After all, many of his comrades were in the hands of the Gestapo, and it was possible that someone would betray him and other members of the organization who remained at large.
Weret decided to flee. He knew that the Gestapo would certainly set up surveillance of the train station and all roads leading out of the city. Since Weret had spent most of his life in Antwerp, he had no friends in his hometown whom he could confide in. Suddenly he remembered that once in a conversation a member of the organization had mentioned the help given to the resistance movement by the Catholic Church. Monasteries often helped crashed British pilots avoid capture by providing them with monastic clothing. Even the Gestapo did not dare to detain or search people wearing religious garb. Weret knew that there was a monastery on the outskirts of Courtrai and decided to sneak there without wasting time. It was still a long time before curfew, and Weret managed to get there safely. The abbot questioned Weret in detail and, convinced that he had not been sent by the Germans, agreed to help him. Weret stayed at the monastery for several weeks and then was transported to France. He travelled the whole way in the garb of a monk, along with travelling clergy. At the French-Spanish border, Weret joined a group of refugees and eventually reached Lisbon. A few weeks later, he was placed on a steamship bound for the Dutch Indies. From there, like many other refugees, Weret travelled to the United States. He was in an internment camp in Canada for several months before being sent to England and ending up in Glasgow.
At this point, Leopold ended his story. At first, I could not catch anything suspicious in Weret's testimony, so I asked Leopold why he thought the Belgian was a spy. Weret claimed, replied Leopold, that he had been unable to get a job in his native town for a long time, and when he was arrested, in addition to Canadian money, 150 English pounds and 300 American dollars were found. Where did they come from? Yes, a rich refugee. I smiled. And how does he explain all this?
He says it's his savings from 10 years as a waiter. The day the Germans invaded Belgium, he exchanged all his money for English and American currency, believing that sooner or later he would have to flee. Very prudent of him, I remarked. Perhaps it is true. Waiters in big hotels make a good deal of money.
That's true. But I have another suspicion. It seems to me that Weret is not a waiter at all.
Why not? There's nothing definite, Leopold answered, shrugging his shoulders. It's just a feeling I have. He doesn't look like a waiter at all. In the way he speaks and moves, he is more like a man of intelligent labour than a waiter or a servant. There are many words in his speech that a waiter would never think of. I liked Leopold's powers of observation. If the identity of the detainee was in doubt, it was necessary to look more closely at everything that could help to establish the truth. Did you check the people who arrived with Weret? I asked. Is there anyone who knew him in Antwerp or Courtrai? I asked Weret himself about this, but he answered in the negative and said that he had only met them in Lisbon. And Weret's personal effects? Is there anything suspicious among them? Not that I can think of. Good. Good. So you want me to talk to Weret? That would be very good. The next day, Weret was brought to see me. I asked him to tell me again how he had gotten from Canada to England and the situation in Canada and the United States, which had not yet entered the war. As Weret talked, I watched him carefully. The more I looked at his face, the more I got the impression that my interlocutor was a cultured and educated man. His shiny hands caught my eye. A man who had worked as a waiter for many years could not have such hands. Gradually I began to agree with Leopold's conclusions. In front of us was a man of any other profession, but not a waiter. We talked for about half an hour, then in French, then in Flemish. Both are spoken in Belgium, and any Belgian with a high school education is usually fluent in both languages. but the surname Werert is purely Flemish, and Antwerp, where he worked, is a purely Flemish city. I wouldn't be surprised if Werert spoke pure Flemish and somewhat worse French. But Werert had just the opposite. He did not speak Flemish very well, he often stopped to find the right word. In French, however, he spoke fluently. By the end of the conversation I was convinced that Werert was either French or Walloon, but not the Flemish he claimed to be. Up to this point I had not questioned Werert about the details of his flight from Belgium. I had many other things to do, and could not devote all my time to Werert. But Leopold's suspicions and my own were sufficient grounds for concluding that Werert's testimony was false. At the second interrogation, Werert told me at length about his work at Antwerp, his return to Courtrai, and his escape to France. His testimony differed little from that which he had given to Leopold, and I could not discover any significant discrepancy in the facts. I noticed, however, that Werert gave much less detail about the events after his arrival at the monastery. It seemed to me that Werert was telling the truth about how he got to Lisbon, but he could have gotten there not as a real refugee, but as a Gestapo agent. So I decided to focus on questions concerning Werert's life before his return from Antwerp to Courtrai. Before the war, I had been to Antwerp and visited a friend in the very hotel where Werert worked. My memory is not bad, and I had a good idea of the hotel. I had no trouble asking Werert a few questions about the layout of the hotel and the duties of the waiter in the restaurant. Werert answered confusedly and tried in every possible way to avoid answering specific questions. It soon became clear to me that he had never been a waiter, nor had he served in the Antwerp hotel he had mentioned in his testimony. Nor was Werert's account of his life in Courtrai truthful. He could not describe the head of the local resistance organization, nor did he give any names of its members. It became quite obvious to me that Werert was a German agent. I told him that I did not believe his testimony. First, he was not Flemish; second, he was not a waiter; and third, the money seized from him at his arrest was not his labour savings. After this I demanded a confession from Werert. "But I'm telling the truth," Werert protested. "You seem to take me for a fool," I replied. "What kind of a Flemishman are you if you cannot speak your own language fluently? You may have been in the hotel, but only as a guest, not as a waiter in the restaurant. A man who has worked in a hotel for a long time knows every corner of it, and even more so the restaurant. You have failed to answer my questions. Let's not waste time. I suggest you come clean." "I'm telling the truth," Werert insisted. This went on for several hours. I went back again and again to the places in Werert's testimony that might incriminate him. But he wouldn't give up, so I decided to take a break. The next day I called the counterintelligence service of the Belgian government in exile and asked one of the officers to help me establish Werert's identity. I needed, among other things, to prove to Werert that he was lying by pretending to be Flemish. After a few minutes' conversation with Werert in my presence, the officer confirmed my suspicions and said that the detainee was certainly not Flemish. "What do you say to that, Mr. Werert?" I asked. "My colleague is Flemish. He spoke to you in your own language and he thinks you are not Flemish." Werert persisted. Even after my Belgian colleague left, he continued to say that he was only telling the truth. Werert's interrogations became a kind of contest of patience. I had no doubt that I would eventually succeed in breaking Werert's will, but it had to be done as quickly as possible. So I decided to resort to a trick which I thought would at once disprove Werert's version that he was a waiter. I must confess that I did not get permission from my superiors to perform this stunt. The investigative team in which I worked was then under the authority of the Ministry of the Interior, whose officers were excessively lenient in their treatment of suspected enemy agents. In this case, I intended to resort to a method which would surely have aroused the objection of the hearty officers of the Ministry of the Interior. I knew of a Belgian refugee whose vetting had already been completed and had shown his utter devotion to the Allied cause. He was soon to be released from an internment camp. His name was François. I asked him to help me expose Werert. Werert was called to my office, and 5 minutes later François showed up. He said hello to me, and turning to Werert, exclaimed, "Ah, Jules Werert. What are you doing here, you dirty spy? The last time I saw you was at the door of the spy school in Antwerp. Verert was stunned. He turned white and shouted back. You're a liar. Who are you? I see you for the first time. Then, turning to me, Verert continued, I protest. What right has he to call me a spy? At the same moment, Verert threw François to the floor and began to strangle him. Only the convoy I had summoned was able to calm the rampaging Verert. When order was restored, I asked François, can you state under oath that this man's name is Jules Verert and that he is a German spy? Yes, replied François confidently. Thank you. I'm sorry to disturb you. You are dismissed. With these words I made a sign to one of the escorts, and he led François away. Verert took a long time to come to his senses. He was so shocked and agitated by what had happened that it seemed to me pointless to question him at that moment. You realize now what a difficult position you are in, I remarked, as I saw Verert off with the escort. I had only suspicions, and now I have a witness who is ready to testify under oath that you are a spy. Your case is hopeless. Go and think it over carefully. When you're ready to tell the truth, come to me again.
An hour later, I received a note from Verert requesting a meeting. I immediately ordered him to be brought in.
Verert must have been very nervous. As soon as he entered the office, without waiting for my question, he shouted, I am neither Jules Verert nor a waiter. I'm a doctor. My name is André Vernaud. I'm from Paris. I invited him to sit down and calm down, and then asked him to tell me more about himself. I had a surgical clinic in Brussels. After a long silence, Verert said Vernaud. Good, go on.
But that was all I managed to hear from him. He did not answer any of my questions and kept repeating that he was a doctor, that his name was Vernaud, and that he lived in Brussels. From the rest of his testimony it appeared that he was a refugee and had indeed travelled all the way that he had described before.
From my point of view, this man was undoubtedly a German agent. It was possible that he was really a doctor, but that did not exclude the possibility of his being used by the Germans to their advantage. There have been such cases before. A doctor is a lucrative profession for a spy, and if Vernaud had managed to slip through our networks, he could have been of considerable use to German intelligence. I decided to once again ask for help in the Belgian counterintelligence and asked to report all the data available to her about André Vernaud. It turned out that the Belgians really had a dossier on this man, but when I got acquainted with the case, I was ready to burn with shame. It turned out that Vernaud had long been known to the Belgian police as the keeper of a clandestine abortion parlour. Receiving huge profits from his criminal activities, this man became a real rich man and kept all his savings in a Swiss bank. Shortly before the German invasion of Belgium, the police were issued a warrant for the arrest of Vernaud, but he managed to escape. Since the summer of 1940, neither the Belgian counterintelligence nor the Gestapo, looking for Vernaud, nothing was known about him. That was the end of the André Vernaud case. We had no reason to detain him, and he was handed over to the Belgian authorities. As far as I knew, Vernaud remained in England and worked in the surgical department of the clinic that served the staff of the Belgian government in exile.
My intuition failed me in the case of Jules Verret, but fortunately, none of my counterintelligence colleagues ever learned of this mistake.
At the beginning of 1941, the Abwehr managed to recruit one of those Dutchmen who were to operate on the territory of Belgium, Denmark and Holland on the instructions of British intelligence. Abwehr activities related to the use of this agent, the Germans called the English game. And although the traitor was eventually exposed and executed, the results of his work had disastrous consequences for us. In the 2 years that passed after the beginning of the English game, in Holland were transferred 52 agents of British intelligence, but all of them were immediately captured by the Gestapo. The fact is that the traitor gave the Abwehr call signs and ciphers that were used for radio communication with agents thrown by British intelligence in Holland. The Germans learned in advance about the location of each group of English spies, and they became easy prey for the Gestapo. With the help of its radio station, The Abwehr informed the British about the safe arrival of the group. English game cost many of our scouts their lives. In addition, for more than 2 years, British intelligence had virtually no effective network in Holland.
Only in the second half of 1942, the British command began to suspect that the organisation of intelligence on the territory of Holland is something wrong. The transfer of agents to this country was reduced. By this time, under the Dutch government in London, the so-called Overseas Police, a counterintelligence organisation designed to work in the armed forces of Free Holland and among the Dutch living in England, had been established. In October 1942, I was called to the headquarters of the Foreign Police and there offered a job which I had long liked and was familiar with from my experience of checking refugees.
My first assignment at the new place was to check our agents scheduled for transfer to the continent. First of all, I was to check how well these agents had internalized their legend. At first, I was bitterly disappointed in the quality of the agents' training. I wrote several reports to my superiors, and to some extent I was able to achieve a more careful approach to the people sent to work behind enemy lines. In addition to checking already trained agents, I was assigned to select volunteers for sabotage and reconnaissance work. We could not entrust the work behind enemy lines to untested people. It was necessary to obtain complete information about the motives for which a person volunteered to do dangerous and difficult work as a scout, to establish how prepared he was for such work, and whether he knew the area in which he was to operate. At the end of 1942, I had to deal with the case of a certain Jan Rebeck. He was about 25 years old. This slender and handsome young man worked as a clerk in one of the organs of the Dutch government in London. One day he applied for an opportunity to participate in sabotage and reconnaissance work in German-occupied territory.
Before the Germans invaded Holland, he lived with his uncle in Utrecht and prepared to defend his dissertation. In early 1942, he fled Holland for England, where he was vetted and granted a residence permit.
I interrogated Rebeck for several hours and finally became convinced that he was a true patriot. Never before had I seen a man so gripped by passion for the struggle. But passion alone was not enough. We needed men of sound judgment, able to endure solitude for many months, able to keep a secret. When I asked him why he wanted to return to Holland again, Rebeck replied that he could help us in ways that others could not. Seeing that I was surprised by his answer and did not understand what he was saying, Rebeck continued. I have already told you that my uncle lives in Utrecht. The hotel where he served as manager was requisitioned by the Germans 2 years ago. It was used as a headquarters and an officer's mess. My uncle still works at the hotel and is now in charge of the canteen. He'll help me get a job as a waiter. An agent working directly in the headquarters building would be very useful, wouldn't it? That's right, of course, I said. But you've lived in Utrecht for a long time, and you're bound to be recognized. There may well be some Germans who have seen you before. Your return to Utrecht would be tantamount to suicide.
I'm not supposed to know about it, Rebeck answered after a short thought, but I've heard that a surgeon can change a man's face so that even his own mother won't recognize him. I'm ready for any operation.
Rebeck was right. The best surgeons performed plastic surgery on agents sent into areas where they would be recognized by the locals. But plastic surgery could ruin your face. You're beautiful, and you'll probably regret it later, I explained. It doesn't matter, Rebeck objected sharply. So far beauty has not brought me happiness. I admired Rebeck's behaviour and recommended that he be sent to a reconnaissance and sabotage school. Rebeck successfully completed the course, mastered radio, learned microphotography and various methods of gathering information about the location and composition of enemy troops. Rebeck turned out to be a hard-working and inquisitive student. He constantly demanded to finish his training as soon as possible. Often I was interested in the progress of the training of people who had been tested by me. Rebeck, as I learned, turned out to be one of the most capable students of the school. At the end of March 1943, he was sent to a special hospital for plastic surgery of the face. In May of the same year, Rebeck was already fully ready for shipment. He was dropped by parachute near Leiden. Almost a week from Rebeck did not receive any information, and suddenly a radiogram from Holland was received. It said, The treaty is signed. This meant that Riebeck had reached Utrecht and had managed to make contact with his uncle. I thought for a long time about how difficult it must have been for Riebeck to convince his uncle that he was his nephew. From time to time Riebeck sent reports, and each time they contained useful information about German troops in the Utrecht area. Riebeck proved to be a very valuable agent. One day in July, a police inspector came into my office. He was in charge of the precinct where our organization was located, so we were well acquainted with him. The inspector's name was Jenkins. Offering him a cigarette, I jokingly asked him, "What's the matter, Inspector? Are you going to scold us again for not keeping the lights on?" "No, it's more serious than that," Jenkins replied. "I'm investigating the circumstances of a woman's murder. Tell me, do you know this man?" The inspector handed me a photograph, and I recognized Riebeck at once. He was like that before the operation. "By the way, Inspector," I said, "before you tell me what this is all about, I'd like to know what you think this man has to do with us. After all, we keep our organization secret." "Don't worry," Sir Jenkins replied, smiling. "No one is thinking of revealing your secrets. We suspect that this man is a foreigner, so we have contacted a number of embassies, including the Embassy of Holland. They advised us to talk to you. That's all." "That's all. I just wanted to make sure that everything was done according to form. What happened?" "Turns out the kids accidentally found a woman's body in the rubble of a building destroyed by a bomb blast. The autopsy revealed that the woman had died several months ago, and apparently a violent death. It took the police quite some time to establish that the woman had once rented a room in the house destroyed by the bomb. She worked as a saleswoman in a small shop, and in the evening sometimes helped wash dishes in a beer hall near her home. As she did not show up for a long time, the landlady rented the room to another person and put her things in the attic. Among these things was found a photograph with the inscription 'Forever yours, Johnny.' In addition, a diary was found which also mentioned Johnny's name and had a record of his jealous nature. The diary entries, corroborated by the testimony of neighbors, indicated that Betty was a rather easygoing girl. That's the picture." Jenkins finished his story. "Now you can see why we want to find this man. He's supposed to help the investigation." "You have found a very apt expression, Inspector," I remarked. "In reality, you want to arrest this man on a charge of murder, do you not?" "Perhaps. The case is quite clear. A jealous foreigner, a lecherous girl, a quarrel, and then in a fit of jealousy he probably killed her and then, to cover up the crime, hid the body in the rubble of the ruined house. It could have been that. But it could have been otherwise. How?"
According to your information, this woman was free with men. She could have been killed by any one of them, perhaps even a man who had never been seen in the neighborhood before. Maybe this woman was a prostitute who brought a customer into her room. They had an argument, and there's your murder.
"A man like that would leave the room and not waste time dragging a corpse to a bomb-damaged house. We have no reason to believe the victim was a prostitute. On top of everything else, this Johnny knew about the woman's disappearance. How do we know that?" A week or two after the woman disappeared, her housemate met Johnny in town and asked him what happened to Betty. Johnny then replied that she had had to go to Newcastle to see her mother. The neighbour found Johnny's answer strange, since Betty had never mentioned that her mother lived in Newcastle. So if Johnny was innocent, then why would he make up the whole story? We should definitely talk to him. If he can prove his alibi, which I doubt very much, we'll have to keep looking for the culprit. By the way, do you think this Johnny is a strong man?" "Yes," I answered, remembering Riebeck's broad shoulders and muscular arms. "What's the matter?" "Judging from the nature of the injuries that caused the woman's death and the effort it took to hide her corpse under the rubble of the building, the killer must have had great strength. In a fit of anger, a man sometimes has strength he doesn't even realize he has." "That's true. But Betty was a large woman, and not everyone could have lifted her. There's too much that's unclear about this case. We don't know where the murder took place, who the killer is, and so on. You don't have any direct evidence yet, do you?" There may be no direct evidence, but there's reason to talk to this Johnny. He'll certainly help the investigation. Can we get him down here? I'm prepared to wait.
You'll have to wait a long time, Inspector.
Why? What I'm about to tell you is a state secret. A few weeks ago, Jan Rybeck was sent by us to work in Holland. He's our agent. Can you summon him? In principle, of course I can, but I won't do it. The inspector looked at me in surprise. I hope I understand you correctly, he said, and that you do not intend to deliberately deprive us of our duty. Look here, Inspector, I replied, irritably. Let's talk informally. You need to question this man. His guilt has not been established. Taking him to England and putting him on trial will not bring back the life of the dead woman. We suffered a serious setback in Holland not long ago, and we've only now re-established our network in that country. Every man counts, and Rybeck is on an important mission. If he's innocent, all is well. If he's proven to be a criminal, then let him do something to make it up to me. I beg you to understand me. You are right, of course, said the inspector, but I also have a certain task to perform to find and apprehend Rybeck. That is exactly what I intend to do. Well, we'll see how things develop, I said. If your superiors persuade my superiors to order me to bring Rybeck to England, of course I will obey. But it seems to me that such an order will not follow. You'll probably have to wait until the end of the war. I was right. I never received the order to summon Rybeck. But at the same time, a thought plagued me. I remembered how Rybeck had been in a hurry to go on the mission. Rybeck may have been a murderer, but it was now more important to keep him in Holland than to keep him in custody in an English prison. In the summer of 1944, shortly before the Allied landings in Normandy, reports suddenly stopped coming from Rybeck. Previously, Rybeck was very careful and never delayed the transfer of information collected by him for more than a week. Our attempts to find out through other agents what had happened to Rybeck were fruitless. Perhaps Rybeck made some mistake and the Germans arrested him. It could also be so, fearing arrest by the British military police for the crime committed, Rybeck decided to go into hiding while the British troops had not yet landed in Europe. Week after week passed, and there was no news of Rybeck. The criminal case against him was apparently still open, for the inspector of police came to see me more than once and inquired when it would be possible to summon Rybeck to England. Finally, I could not stand it and confessed to the inspector that we ourselves had had no contact with Rybeck for a long time and did not know what had happened to him. In July 1944, I was appointed head of the Dutch counterintelligence mission at the headquarters of the Supreme Commander of the Allied forces and went to the continent after the troops. Utrecht was not liberated until April 1945. Then I took the opportunity to talk to Rybeck's uncle and find out about the fate of his nephew. It turned out that Rybeck's uncle was no less surprised than we were at the sudden disappearance of his nephew. He told me that Rybeck had returned to Utrecht about a year and a half ago. With great difficulty, it had been possible to get him a job as a waiter in the officers' mess. Rybeck often did not return home for long periods after work, and his uncle began to suspect that his nephew was connected with the resistance movement and was on some secret mission. At that time, it was not customary to take an interest in people's affairs, especially if they were subversive activities against the Germans, and the uncle did not question his nephew. One evening, Rybeck told his uncle that he was going to meet a friend and would return home late. Who this friend was, Rybeck did not say. He left and never came back. The uncle was very disturbed and thought that a misfortune had happened to his nephew. After all, if Rybeck had intended to disappear for a long time, he would surely have said so. If he was captured by the Gestapo, they would probably start making inquiries about him. Rybeck's disappearance remained a mystery. I thanked Uncle Rybeck for the information and promised to let him know if I could find out anything about his nephew. During the next few months, I often wondered what could have happened to Rybeck, and more than once I thought that he was hiding from English justice, just as he had once tried not to fall into the clutches of the Gestapo. The mystery was solved after the end of the war. One day, over a cup of coffee, I was talking to an old friend of mine who had successfully led a resistance group in the Hilversum area for a long time during the war. We talked about how often in wartime we had to make impromptu decisions without being sure of their correctness. My friend said at the time, "I once made a serious mistake because of my haste. We exposed a traitor in our group, but he somehow found out about it and managed to escape to Utrecht. The name of that city made me suspicious, and I asked, 'What happened?'
We had to destroy this traitor quickly," my friend replied. "Otherwise he would have turned us all over to the Gestapo. This task was assigned to one of the members of our group, whom the traitor did not know."
"What did this traitor look like?" I asked. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, apparently a professional boxer with traces of surgery on his face. And suddenly I realized everything. Apparently, Rybek's appearance after the operation had become remarkably similar to the wanted traitor from Hilversum.
"How did the whole story end?" I asked. "Our man went to Utrecht and killed the traitor, but soon it turned out that he was wrong. The murdered man turned out to be a completely innocent waiter in the officers' canteen." "Yes, mistakes are inevitable in war," I remarked. "As to the innocence of the waiter, it would be best to ask the English police. Maybe they have a different opinion."
One autumn morning in 1943, I received an unexpected phone call from the Dutch air attaché and asked me to go immediately to the British bomber airbase in East Anglia. I inquired what was the matter, but received no intelligible answer. The attaché only told me that the ambassador himself was interested in the case and expected a detailed report from me as soon as possible. For many years of service, I had already got used to the fact that big bosses like to turn a trifling matter into a matter of national importance and to shroud everything in secrecy. However, this air attaché was a different person. He could not be called a bureaucrat. If he said that the matter was important, then it was really necessary to get to the bottom of everything as soon as possible. Soon I was already at the airbase. The car stopped in front of a grey brick building, which housed the headquarters of the squadron of the Dutch Air Force, which was in England. The chief of staff of the squadron met me and escorted me to a pre-arranged room. When I asked him about the reasons for such an urgent summons, he said that it was better to wait for the commander, who would explain what was wrong. I did not have to wait long. The door opened and two young officers entered the room. One of them identified himself as Lieutenant Colonel Denker and the other as Captain Bergen. At first the conversation turned to news of London life, events at the fronts, and food shortages, but I soon got bored with that and decided to get down to business. "You must have a lot to do," I said, "and I am not bored in London either. I've been summoned here at short notice, and on important business, but so far I know nothing. LT. Cole." Denker smiled, looked at the captain, and replied, "Excuse me, we will tell you everything now. This is about protecting our honour. I asked the attaché to send us an experienced investigator to understand what is happening. If our suspicions are correct, he will surely take appropriate action. If we are wrong, let no one know of our conversation. What are your suspicions?" I asked.
"Captain Bergen will tell you in a moment. That's his department," said the lieutenant colonel.
The captain coughed and began. "Our squadron is staffed by Dutch pilots. I am the pilot and commander of one of the bombers. In addition to me in the crew, there are 4 others: navigator, radio operator, and 2 gunners. The bomber crew has to work in harmony, and each of us always relies on the other crew members for help. Except for the navigator, everyone has been flying together for a long time and knows each other well. Our former navigator, for health reasons, has recently been suspended from flying, and instead of him sent another, a man of advanced age, who is old enough to be our fathers. This man's name is Van Waal. He is an experienced navigator who has worked on KLM airplanes for many years. You know that it takes a while to get used to a new person in a team. I must admit that we did everything to make Van Waal feel like an equal member of our friendly flying family. But he turned out to be a rather reserved person and refused to participate in our parties, even though he had more money than all of us put together. Apparently, KLM pays its pilots well." "The pilots at KLM don't earn that much," I said. "Anyway, they get a little more than military pilots. The captain said that Van Wale's behaviour irritated the rest of the crew. He too often started talking about the superiority of German pilots, their high professional skill. At first the crew members regarded Van Wale's remarks as an unintelligent joke, but later they began to take his barbed remarks more and more often as mockery. Soon after Van Wale's arrival in the squadron, some strange incidents began to happen to our crew. Each of them separately could be explained, but together they acquired a rather unpleasant colouring. Once, during a combat sortie, Van Wale made a serious error in course guidance, and the crew failed to complete the mission. Another time Van Wale, who was a navigator bombardier, did not drop the bombs in the proper place, and his behaviour explained by the fact that, say, the bomb thrower failed. The plane was returning to base with a full bomb load, and Bergen decided to release the bombs as the plane flew over the sea. One of the gunners was an electrical specialist, and Bergen asked him to take Van Wale's place at the ejector. He pressed a button and the bomb hatch opened immediately. Such cases with Vale were not unique, and in the end Bergen decided to consult with the squadron commander. Bergen did come to see me, inserted the lieutenant colonel, and frankly I didn't like this Van Wale from the beginning. When Bergen told me about his behaviour, I wanted to suspend Van Wale from flying, but then changed my mind after all. Every pilot and navigator we have counted. If he is not a coward, but a traitor and a spy, it is dangerous to leave him in the unit anyway. That's why I've decided to call you. You must help us solve this problem. It seems to me personally that this is not a matter of cowardice at all. Before contacting our attach, I've made a careful study of Van Wale's background. He is from Rotterdam and joined KLM as a young man. After passing his exams, Van Wale soon became a navigator and worked on the Amsterdam to London line. Van Wale was with his airplane in London when the Germans invaded Holland. He worked on the London-Lisbon line until recently, and then volunteered to join our Air Force. You say he flew to Lisbon? That's an interesting detail, I remarked. But you seem to be worried about something else. Where did Vale get the money? Because he didn't come from a rich family, isn't he? We are concerned about everything his money, and everything that began to happen in the squadron after he came to us, answered Lieutenant Colonel. But as Bergen has already noted, I continued each case with Vale individually can be explained. After all, he could have accidentally made a mistake in calculating the course. The bomb thrower could have failed. That's for you to decide, Denker objected. We are ready to help you. First of all, I need to talk to Van Wale, and then maybe everything will be clear. Vale turned out to be one of the most unpleasant people I had to meet in my long service in counterintelligence. I had accustomed myself not to give in to my first impression of a person, but the feeling of dislike for him did not leave me from the very first minutes after Vale entered my office. In order not to arouse Vale's suspicions, Denker, Bergen, and I had agreed in advance that I would introduce myself to him as a Dutch journalist collecting material on the heroes of my countrymen. I was to tell Wale that I was going to write an article about Dutch Air Force pilots. Wale fell for it. In vivid colours he told me about his short service in the military Air Force. From his story it appeared that he was insistent on completing every mission without regard for danger to life, and this, apparently, did not please the rest of the crew. Vale emphasised several times that the unfriendly attitude towards him seemed to be the result of jealousy. At the same time, Vale expressed regret that he had not joined the military aviation earlier, because he could have already commanded a squadron.
As I listened to Vale, I watched him carefully. He smoked one cigarette after another and never offered me a smoke. The gold cigarette case and the expensive lighter that Vale used reminded me of Bergen's suspicions.
Our conversation continued for about an hour, and when Vale's self-promotion bored me, I interrupted the conversation, citing the need to return urgently to London. I promised Vale to meet him again as soon as the outline of the article was ready. When I returned to London, I immediately sent an inquiry to KLM. It turned out that in the last 3 years, Vale had been to Lisbon on several occasions with the flight. Although the crews on this line changed frequently, I was able to find someone who knew Van Wale well, and he told me a lot about him. A few days later I sent a telegram to the airbase where Van Wale was serving and asked permission to meet him again. Vale showed up just 5 minutes after my arrival at the base. He was very surprised that I invited Bergen to participate in the conversation, but I was able to quickly dispel his suspicions. The thing is, I explained that the Ministry of Aviation requires that I published my article faster, and for this requires your consent, as well as the consent of your immediate superior. I have only one copy of the article, and if you don't mind, I'll read it out. The article is short, and I will keep you for a while. Coughing, I began. More than once I have had to meet outstanding people full of courage and insight. But none of these men can compare to the man I met recently among the Dutch military pilots. Having familiarized himself with this article, he will probably not be pleased that I have mentioned his surname and first name, but I cannot help doing so. His name is Van Waal. Coming from a simple family, Van Waal became a civil aviation pilot before the war. He served for a long time with a renowned airline. Finally made an important decision, voluntarily joined the Dutch Air Force. What made a man give up a well-to-do life and take up a job associated with danger and hardship? Patriotic duty? The desire to keep up with his compatriots who bravely joined the fight against the enemy? Romantic motives? No. Here is what one of Van Waal's old acquaintances, who had flown with him on KLM airplanes for a long time, said about it. Van Waal hastily left the civil aviation service. Why? Because the diamond speculation that Van Waal was engaged in Lisbon had become a dangerous business. I looked at Van Waal. My article was, of course, a bluff, but the trick had succeeded. Vale turned pale, jumped up and wanted to say something, but I stopped him. Listen, Vale, I shouted. Don't argue with me. I have enough evidence, and I even have your acquaintance's affidavit. Besides, he handed me the cigarette box in which you used to hide the diamonds. You can see your box in this photograph. You bought diamonds in London and sold them in Lisbon at a speculative price. You did not care about the fact that the diamonds fell into the hands of your enemies, who used them in a war against the country that had given you asylum. Vale couldn't take it anymore. 5 minutes later he confessed everything, giving the names and addresses of the persons with whom he was in contact in London and Lisbon. On the verdict of the court-martial, Van Waal was dismissed from the Dutch military aviation. He was then immediately arrested by the British police on charges of smuggling and aiding the enemy. Van Waal was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Had he not been a foreigner, the court would hardly have been so lenient on him.